So right now, inside, these highly advanced, high-tech IVF clinics all over the world, reproductive endocrinologists are doing some pretty incredible things.
Oh, absolutely. It's space age stuff.
Right. I mean, they are retrieving human eggs, fertilizing them in these incredibly sterile labs, and monitoring them with time-lapse incubators. But the really wild part, the
Yeah.
most shocking breakthrough in boosting the success of all this hypermodern science isn't coming from like a new microchip.
Right.
And it isn't some brand new synthetic hormone either. It is actually coming from needles and herbal compounds that were literally being utilized thousands of years ago.
Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. I'm so glad you're joining us.
It really is jarring when you look at it on paper, right?
Mm.
I mean, we are watching the ultimate procedural intervention, which is, in vitro fertilization, finally integrating with the ultimate holistic intervention.
They quite the contrast.
It is.
Yeah.
And the clinical data that's emerging from this intersection is, well, it's forcing a massive paradigm shift in reproductive medicine, which brings us right to the core of this deep dive. We're looking at some really fascinating clinical insights compiled by Mike Berkeley.
Yes, from the Berkeley Center for Reproductive Wellness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for context, this is a clinic that has spent 30 years specializing exclusively in this specific intersection of fertility challenges.
30 years is a long time to be collecting data on this.
It really is. And the entire premise here is that acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine can no longer be categorized with that, slightly dismissive label of alternative medicine.
Right. That word carries so much baggage.
It does. They've actually transitioned into vital evidence-based adjuncts for IVF.
And that terminology shift from alternative to adjunct is just so critical. It really implies a coordinated partnership rather than just sort of a fallback option.
Yeah, totally. So for you listening right now, whether you're deep in the trenches of fertility treatments yourself, or maybe you're just fascinated by cellular biology, or, you just love seeing hard data dismantle decade-old medical assumptions, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you understand the biological environment of reproduction.
I think it will, yeah. Because if you look at the baseline assumptions from, I don't know, even a decade ago, the standard medical advice regarding acupuncture during IVF was incredibly passive.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you hear it all the time from well-meaning doctors, right? They'll say, well, acupuncture can't hurt, but there's no real evidence it actually helps.
Right, exactly.
It's treated like a spa day. Like, oh, it's a nice way to relax, but clinically irrelevant.
Yeah, and that older perspective relied really heavily on a handful of, frankly, underpowered small-scale studies.
Studies that just didn't have the numbers.
Exactly. They just didn't have the statistical weight to prove much of anything. But the source material makes it incredibly clear that the evidence landscape has fundamentally transformed.
We're talking massive studies now.
Huge. We now have these massive meta-analyses pulling from dozens of randomized controlled trials that just completely invalidate that old can't hurt, doesn't help narrative.
So to understand why that old quote is obsolete, I think we have to isolate what IVF is actually designed to do. And perhaps more importantly, the biological layers it completely ignores by design.
That's a great point, because IVF is arguably one of the greatest marvels of procedural medicine.
Without a doubt.
If a patient is dealing with mechanical barriers, say bilaterally blocked fallopian tubes or severe male factor infertility where the sperm simply cannot reach the egg.
Or profound anovulation where no egg is being released at all.
Right, exactly. IVF provides a definitive mechanical bypass for those issues.
It is unmatched at retrieving the biological material, achieving fertilization in a dish, growing that embryo to a blastocyst stage, and then physically placing it inside the uterus.
It's a logistical masterpiece, really.
It is. But, if we think about reproduction, like an agricultural process, like trying to grow a rare plant IVF, is simply a highly automated greenhouse transplant system.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, like it is brilliantly engineered to extract the seed, germinate it in a controlled lab, and drop it into the soil. But, and this is the key, IVF does absolutely nothing to enrich the soil itself.
Right.
Nor does it improve the internal genetic or cellular quality of the seed prior to extraction.
And what's fascinating here is that distinction between procedural and regenerative medicine, that is the absolute crux of the issue.
Because it's just moving things around.
Exactly. IVF moves biological material around with incredible precision, but it does not repair the underlying biological environment that caused dysfunction in the first place.
So when a patient goes through a grueling, incredibly expensive IVF cycle, transfers a genetically normal embryo, and then experiences an implantation failure or an early miscarriage.
Which happens frequently, unfortunately.
Right. There's this natural tendency to just assume something went wrong with the transfer procedure itself.
Which completely ignores the fact that the underlying physiological issues, like poor uterine perfusion, chronic systemic inflammation, or severe oxidative stress within the gametes, they were likely present long before that transfer catheter ever entered the room.
Because IVF doesn't treat those variables at all.
It doesn't. And this is where the modern data on ancient Chinese medicine really steps into the spotlight. Let's look at the 2025 systematic review and meta-analysis that was highlighted in the Berkeley Center text.
Yeah, the sheer scale of this research is what really caught my attention when I was reading it.
It's staggering. We are looking at pooled data from 42 randomized trials.
Wow, 42.
42. Encompassing over 7,400 women undergoing IVF.
That is massive.
In the realm of reproductive research, a sample size of 7,400 is highly, highly robust. And the findings demonstrated that acupuncture significantly increased clinical pregnancy rates compared to sham acupuncture or no treatment at all.
And they gave a specific number for that, right?
Right. Yes, showing a relative risk of 1.19.
Okay, but the live birth rates, which, let's be honest, is the only metric that truly matters to a patient trying to take a baby home, were even higher.
Much higher. The pooled estimates for live birth rates showed a relative risk ranging from 1.34 to 1.91.
Okay, wait, let's translate that 1.34 relative risk into absolute terms for a second. Because, in fertility statistics, a relative jump can sometimes sound huge, but actually mask a tiny absolute gain.
Oh, absolutely. Statistics can be tricky that way.
Right. So what does a 1.34 relative risk actually look like for a patient's overall probability of succeeding?
Let's apply that to a hypothetical baseline to make it clear. Say a specific age demographic has a 35% live birth rate using IVF alone.
Okay, 35%. Got it.
A 1.34 relative risk acts as a multiplier. When you factor that in, the absolute live birth rate jumps by roughly 12 percentage points.
Oh, wow. So they go from a 35% chance to a 47% chance.
Correct. And in reproductive endocrinology, where clinics will literally fight tooth and nail for a 1 or 2% improvement in their success rates,
A 12 percentage point jump is wild.
it's monumental. It shifts the odds from roughly 1 in 3 to almost 1 in 2.
Okay, but I have to push back a little here, just to play devil's advocate.
Go for it.
Because the gap between the statistical outcome and the physical reality of the treatment is where a lot of highly logical people, myself included, get a bit stuck.
Sure, it sounds a little too good to be true.
Well, and when we hear acupuncture, the cultural framing still leans heavily into the metaphysical, right? We hear about qi and invisible meridians and, energy flow.
Right, which isn't the language of modern biomedicine.
Exactly. So how does the physical microtrauma of sticking a needle into the skin of the lower leg fundamentally alter the biological environment of an egg developing inside the ovary?
That is the exact right question. And the answer is that the mechanism of action isn't metaphysical at all. It's entirely neurological and biochemical. The source material outlines 5 specific, measurable physiological systems that acupuncture impacts. And the first one is all about the nervous system. The insertion of the needle creates a microtrauma that sends an afferent signal to the central nervous system, specifically the spinal cord and the brain.
And then the brain responds to that.
Exactly. The brain responds with efferent signals via the autonomic nervous system. And the first measurable result of that signaling is a change in pelvic and uterine blood flow.
Which is something they can actually see, right?
Yeah.
Like Doppler ultrasound studies actually capture this happening in real time. We see improved vascular tone.
Yes.
But just to be clear, when we say vascular tone, that means the blood vessels are relaxing and dilating rather than, constricting.
Yes, exactly. Acupuncture mechanically reduces sympathetic nervous system activity, which is our fight or flight response.
Okay, and that causes the vessels to open up.
Right. It naturally causes vasodilation. When the uterine and ovarian arteries dilate, the actual volume of blood reaching those organs increases significantly.
Which solves a massive mechanical issue. Like a thin endometrial lining or poor perfusion means the embryo doesn't have the nutrient-dense vascular bed it needs to implant.
Spot on. But we have to look at the second and third mechanisms to see why blood flow alone isn't enough.
Right, because if we are increasing perfusion, we are bringing more oxygen and nutrients to the uterus. But what if the systemic environment is already highly inflamed?
Which is common.
Yeah, say a patient has silent endometriosis or chronic endometritis. Pumping more blood into a highly inflamed uterine environment seems counterproductive. You're basically just feeding the fire.
Which is exactly why the third mechanism modulating inflammation has to happen concurrently.
Oh, okay.
The neurological signaling we just discussed also regulates the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the second mechanism.
And what does that axis do, practically speaking?
By modulating the HPA axis, acupuncture helps regulate the immune response. It actively reduces the expression of inflammatory cytokines in the pelvic region.
Oh, I see. So it is simultaneously increasing the delivery system, the blood flow, while actively downregulating the inflammatory markers that are being transported in that blood.
Exactly. It fundamentally alters the biochemical composition of the environment because a highly inflamed uterus is hostile to a foreign body.
And an embryo is technically a foreign body.
Precisely. By lowering that inflammatory signaling, the uterine receptivity goes up. And as a bonus, the HPA axis modulation also stabilizes the neuroendocrine feedback loop governing estrogen and progesterone.
Which would be vital for patients dealing with PCOS or irregular cycles.
Absolutely vital.
So we are essentially watching the central nervous system act as this giant switchboard,
Right.
redirecting resources. But I want to pivot to the fourth mechanism, because here's where it gets really interesting.
The mitochondria.
Yes, because we know mitochondrial ATP production is the primary bottleneck for embryo division. It's like a cell phone battery degrading over time, right?
That's a perfect way to picture it.
So how does a neurological signal actually shift the energy output inside a microscopic cell?
This comes down to the battle between oxidative stress and mitochondrial function. We have to remember that human eggs sit in a state of suspended animation in the ovaries for decades.
Right, literally from before the person was even born.
Exactly. And during those 20, 30, or 40 years, they are constantly accumulating oxidative damage from free radicals. And sperm DNA undergoes a very similar fragmentation process.
And when that egg is finally recruited for ovulation, the mitochondria inside it have to generate a staggering amount of ATP to power fertilization and early cellular division.
It's a huge energy demand.
Right. If the battery is degraded by oxidative stress, the embryo just arrests. It stops growing on day 3 or day 4 in the lab.
And this is where the intervention shines. The research indicates that the neurological stimulation of acupuncture actually upregulates the body's systemic antioxidant defense.
Systemically.
Yes. Specifically, it has been shown to decrease a marker called malondialdehyde, which is a direct measure of oxidative damage to cell membranes.
While simultaneously increasing superoxide dismutase.
Yes, which is one of the most powerful antioxidant enzymes the body produces naturally.
So by lowering the oxidative damage and boosting that enzymatic defense, the mitochondria can just function way more efficiently.
Exactly. As the text states, cells with more energy and less damage are simply more likely to fertilize and divide successfully.
Which is a purely biochemical interaction, not magic.
Yeah.
And that leads directly to the fifth mechanism, the stress axis.
Right.
Because going through IVF is notoriously traumatic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the massive financial burden, the daily hormone injections, the constant ultrasound monitoring.
The clinical reality is that elevated cortisol levels actively interfere with the reproductive hormones needed for ovulation and luteal phase stability.
Because cortisol is the stress hormone.
Right. High cortisol tells the body it is in a survival state. And from a biological perspective, a survival state is the absolute opposite of a reproductive state.
So when well-meaning friends or family tell a fertility patient to just relax, which is the worst thing you can say, by the way, they are technically identifying a real biological variable, but offering a completely useless solution.
A completely useless solution. Telling someone to relax doesn't lower cortisol, but acupuncture offers a quantifiable, non-pharmacological intervention to mechanically lower those cortisol levels.
It kind of forces the relaxation biologically.
Yes, it shifts the autonomic nervous system out of that sympathetic overdrive and back into a parasympathetic rest and digest state. It isn't just about feeling emotionally better, it is actively removing a chemical barrier to implantation.
Okay, so just to recap, we have blood flow, neuroendocrine regulation, inflammation reduction, mitochondrial support, and cortisol reduction. That's a huge list.
It is, but the Berkeley-centered text makes it very clear that acupuncture is actually only half of the equation here.
Right, the second half of the conversation.
The physical signaling of the needles shifts the environment, yes, but the Chinese herbal medicine provides the sustained biochemical support.
Because you aren't getting acupuncture 24/7.
Exactly. Acupuncture is the catalyst, but the customized herbal medicine is the daily biological building block. And the data supporting the herbal integration is just as compelling, if not more so.
Yeah, let's look at those numbers.
The text cites a meta-analysis of 20 randomized trials involving over 1,700 women that specifically evaluated Chinese herbal medicine combined with IVF.
And the results of that meta-analysis were, frankly, incredible. They found an odds ratio of 2.04 for clinical pregnancy rates.
Yes, a 2.04 odds ratio.
Which basically means the odds of achieving a clinical pregnancy effectively doubled for the patients utilizing the customized herbal protocols alongside their IVF treatments.
It doubled, but there is a huge caveat here.
I was just going to say, given how highly regulated an IVF cycle is, I'd imagine introducing foreign herbs could completely derail the endocrinologist's hormone protocol.
Well, it absolutely can if done wrong.
I mean, we are talking about precisely timed synthetic gonadotropins that are designed to force the ovaries to produce 20 eggs instead of one. How does introducing a complex herbal formula not cause a massive biochemical clash?
That is the most critical warning in the entire source text. You cannot simply go online and buy a generic, fertility tea.
Right, there is no universal formula.
There isn't, because every patient's biological deficit is different. But more importantly, pharmacokinetics matter. Herbs have half-lives just like pharmaceuticals.
So they require active, precise medical management.
Absolutely. The Berkeley Center team manages this by communicating directly with the patient's reproductive endocrinologist. Herbal protocols must be strategically paused or modified around specific medication windows.
Like around the trigger shot, right? Or the egg retrieval procedure.
Exactly. You have to ensure there is no receptor competition or metabolic interference in the liver.
The timing really is everything. Like, done blindly, herbal medicine could ruin a $20,000 IVF cycle. But done with precise coordination, it doubles the odds of success.
It's all about expertise and timing.
Which brings us to the final and probably most practical piece of this deep dive, the 90-day biological clock.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, knowing what to do is completely useless if you don't know when to do it.
So what does this all mean for someone listening who is looking at their calendar right now, maybe scheduling an embryo transfer for next month?
Well, a lot of clinics offer a quick 20-minute acupuncture session right before the embryo transfer and another one right after. It's just built into the schedule for that specific day.
I've heard of that, yeah.
And according to the 2024 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Integrative and Complementary Medicine, that specific day of transfer dose is not what produces the profound clinical changes we've been discussing.
Really? So just going on the day of the procedure doesn't do it?
A single session on transfer day might slightly lower acute stress for an hour, but it cannot reverse decades of oxidative damage or instantly rebuild a depleted endometrial lining.
That makes total sense. The studies that move the needle, no pun intended, utilize continuous treatment during the controlled ovarian hyperstimulation phase and throughout the prolonged period leading up to a frozen embryo transfer.
Exactly. The threshold for optimal efficacy appears to be protocols lasting 3 months or more, incorporating 20 or more sessions.
But why 3 months? Like, why is 90 days the magic number in reproductive biology?
Because of the life cycle of the gametes themselves. An ovarian follicle doesn't just appear on the day of an ultrasound.
Right.
It takes roughly 90 days for a primordial follicle to wake up, enter the early antral stage, and undergo the final maturation process required for ovulation or retrieval.
Wait, so the egg a doctor retrieves today actually began its active maturation journey 3 months ago?
Exactly. The cellular architecture of that egg, the mitochondrial density, the chromosomal stability we talked about, was being built over the last 90 days.
Oh, wow.
And the same biological timeline dictates spermatogenesis. It takes roughly 72 to 90 days for the male body to produce mature sperm.
So if a couple is dealing with high DNA fragmentation in the sperm or poor egg quality, and they start their acupuncture and herbal protocol, say, a week before the retrieval,
it is biologically too late for that specific cohort of eggs and sperm. They cannot retroactively change the environment that those specific cells already matured inside of.
Though the text does note that if a patient only has 6 weeks before their retrieval, the interventions can still significantly aid in systemic blood flow and cortisol reduction.
Yes, it's always better than nothing. But to fundamentally alter the cellular health, you really need that full 90-day window. You need to be applying the antioxidant support and the vascular dilation while the follicle is actively developing.
It makes so much sense.
It's actually the single most common regret Mike Berkeley hears after 30 years in practice. Patients wishing they had started the holistic prep earlier rather than waiting until they had already experienced a failed cycle.
It totally reframes the entire IVF timeline. Like the procedure doesn't start on the day of the first injection, the preparation has to start 3 months prior. So to sum it up, IVF remains the brilliant procedural tool, the automated transplant system we talked about. But customized acupuncture and herbal medicine are the regenerative tools that actually prepare the soil.
Exactly. They manage the perfusion, the cellular energy, the immune response, and the cortisol over that critical developmental window.
They really are two halves of the same complete medical protocol.
Absolutely.
Well, if you are listening to this and you happen to be in the New York City area and you're preparing for an IVF or IUI cycle, the source text actually provides a highly actionable next step for you.
Yeah, the Berkeley Center.
Right. You can book a 90-minute initial consultation at the Berkeley Center for Reproductive Wellness, which is located on East 40th Street.
And the true value of a specialized consultation like that is the synthesis of information. They review the endocrinology labs, the semen analysis, your complete reproductive history, and then they build a customized, highly coordinated protocol that works safely alongside the Western pharmaceuticals.
Which is huge. You can learn more and set up that consultation directly at berkeleycenter.com.
Reviewing the mechanics of this 90-day window, this raises an important question about how we view our own cellular health.
Oh, where does your mind go with that?
Well, according to the source, these huid eggs sit in the ovary for years, sometimes decades, accumulating oxidative damage while waiting to be recruited, right?
Right.
We tend to view that degradation as an inevitable passive decline, like there's nothing we can do about aging. But if a highly targeted 90-day protocol of neuroendocrine signaling and biochemical herbal support can so profoundly change the cellular energy and the trajectory of an egg that has been waiting in the dark for 30 years.
It completely disrupts the idea that we are just at the mercy of our chronological age.
Exactly. It makes you wonder just how much untapped agency we actually have over our fundamental biology simply by learning how to optimize the microscopic environment those cells live in.
That is an incredible thought to end on. We are not just passengers to our biology. We have the tools to actively tend to the environment. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the old assumptions, keep exploring the data, and most importantly, keep learning. We'll catch you on the next one.